I was supposed to be meeting an accountant named Arthur. The plan was incredibly simple. Show up at the upscale Italian restaurant, slide a cheap, cubic zirconia ring box across the table as a chaotic icebreaker, and watch a boring numbers guy sweat before admitting it was a joke set up by our mutual friend. But right now, the cheap velvet box is sitting halfway across a blood-red tablecloth, and the man staring back at me is absolutely, terrifyingly not an accountant. He possesses eyes like crushed ice and a jawline carved from granite. He hasn't blinked in 10 seconds. Worse, I just noticed the subtle, horrifying shift in the room. The four massive men in tailored suits at the adjacent tables have all silently slipped their hands inside their jackets. The maitre d' has entirely vanished. The ambient clatter of silver on porcelain has dropped to a dead, suffocating silence. I didn't just crash the wrong blind date. I just confidently slid a marriage proposal across the table to a man who is currently evaluating whether to accept my hand or have his heavily armed enforcers eliminate me on the spot. I just proposed to a Mafia lord. The relentless, bone-deep exhaustion of a 60-hour workweek makes you do incredibly stupid things. I was a junior architectural drafter, severely underpaid and constantly surviving on lukewarm coffee and sheer, stubborn spite. My best friend, fiercely determined to pull me out of my self-imposed, workaholic isolation, had practically forced me into a blind date. She swore he was a gentle, mathematically obsessed accountant named Arthur who wore sweater vests and desperately needed a spark of spontaneity in his rigidly structured life. I, operating on 3 hours of sleep and a dangerous level of caffeine, decided to provide exactly that. I stopped at a cheap pawn shop on my way to the glittering, high-end downtown restaurant, spontaneously purchasing a remarkably gaudy, faux diamond engagement ring encased in worn black velvet. My chaotic, sleep-deprived logic was simple. I would dramatically slide the ring across the table the moment I sat down, declare my undying love, and break the notoriously awkward first date ice with a spectacular, unforgettable joke. It was supposed to be a harmless, incredibly memorable prank that would either end in shared laughter or give me a hilarious story to tell for the rest of my miserable, overworked life. When I arrived at the notoriously exclusive Il Vento, the opulent atmosphere immediately made me feel acutely aware of my scuffed boots and slightly wrinkled trench coat. The air smelled heavily of rich truffles, aged wine, and astronomical wealth. The sharply dressed hostess didn't even bother to ask for my name. She took one highly judgmental look at my frantic, hurried demeanor, expertly scanned her leather-bound reservation book, and gestured smoothly toward the shadowed, highly secluded back corner of the sprawling dining room. "The gentleman has been quietly waiting for your arrival," she murmured, her voice practically dripping with practiced, icy discretion. I aggressively adjusted my collar, took a deep, steadying breath to calm my racing heart, and marched confidently toward the dimly lit alcove. My mind was entirely focused on executing the flawless comedic timing of my ridiculous prop. I didn't bother to scan the surrounding tables. I didn't notice the strange, heavy absence of regular patrons in that specific section of the room. I was blindly focused on the broad, impeccably suited shoulders of the man sitting rigidly with his back to the wall, his face completely obscured by the deep, ambient shadows. I confidently pulled out the heavy mahogany chair, completely ignoring standard social grace, and sat down heavily. Before he could even open his mouth to offer a polite, traditional greeting, I reached quickly into my deep trench coat pocket. With the practiced, fluid motion of a seasoned card dealer, I aggressively slid the black velvet box directly across the pristine, heavily starched white tablecloth. It stopped perfectly dead center, resting directly between a crystal water goblet and a silver fork. "Let's just entirely skip the agonizing small talk, Arthur," I declared loudly, a bright, manic smile aggressively plastered across my exhausted face. "I'm incredibly tired. You're supposedly a genius with tax deductions, and I think we should just get married immediately." The absolute, suffocating silence that immediately followed my chaotic declaration was not the shocked, stuttering laughter of a nerdy accountant. It was the heavy, dangerous silence of a fully armed bomb completely failing to detonate on schedule. The man sitting across the pristine white tablecloth slowly leaned forward, deliberately moving out of the deep, obscuring shadows of the secluded alcove, and the bright, manic smile on my face instantly froze into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He was undeniably breathtaking, but in the exact same terrifying way a sudden avalanche or a falling guillotine is breathtaking. He possessed thick, pitch-black hair swept immaculately back from a sharp, aristocratic forehead. His eyes were a startling, piercing shade of pale silver, entirely devoid of any recognizable human warmth or gentle amusement. He was wearing a bespoke, midnight blue suit that clearly cost more than my entire architectural degree, and a heavy, incredibly complex luxury chronograph glinted menacingly on his thick wrist. He didn't look like he crunched numbers for a living. He looked like he systematically crushed human windpipes. He stared down at the cheap, worn black velvet box resting innocently beside his crystal water goblet, and then his silver eyes slowly, methodically tracked back up to aggressively meet mine. The air temperature in the secluded alcove seemed to plummet 20 degrees in a single second. I suddenly, horrifyingly realized that I hadn't just interrupted his dinner, I had violently disrupted an incredibly tense, highly calculated environment. My frantic, terrified gaze flicked nervously past his broad shoulders, finally noticing the terrifying details I had blindly ignored in my rushing approach. The four incredibly large men sitting at the two adjacent tables weren't eating. They didn't even have menus in front of them. They were all staring directly at me with dead, predatory eyes, and their thick hands had simultaneously disappeared silently inside their tailored suit jackets. The maitre d', who usually hovered attentively in this VIP section, was absolutely nowhere to be seen. The entire back half of the luxurious restaurant had been meticulously cleared out, intentionally converted into a highly secure, heavily guarded perimeter. "Arthur," the man finally spoke, his voice a low, incredibly smooth baritone that somehow managed to vibrate physically against my breastbone. It carried a faint, dangerous rasp, like heavy steel dragging slowly across rough concrete. "That is a remarkably fascinating name. Tell me, do I genuinely look like an Arthur to you?" My mouth opened, but my severely panicked brain completely failed to supply any functional vocal cords. I could only manage a pathetic, highly undignified squeak. I slowly reached my trembling hand forward, desperately intending to snatch the offending prop box off the table and sprint blindly for the heavy glass exit doors. But before my shaking fingers could even brush the worn velvet, his large, incredibly scarred hand shot forward with preternatural, terrifying speed. He firmly trapped my hand against the table, his skin shockingly warm, but his grip entirely unyielding. He didn't break eye contact as his other hand slowly, deliberately reached out and flipped the cheap little box open, aggressively exposing the aggressively fake, cubic zirconia rock to the dim, ambient lighting of the restaurant. Julian, the Viper, Rossi, a name I would only learn in the terrifying, chaotic hours to come, stared deeply at the hilariously massive, fake diamond glittering obnoxiously against the cheap velvet. For a single, agonizingly long second, absolute confusion violently warred with cold, calculated rage across his aristocratic features. He was the undisputed, heavily feared head of the city's most violent syndicate, currently sitting in this secluded restaurant to violently negotiate a territory dispute with a deeply unstable rival boss. He had fully expected a heavily armed assassin to walk through those doors tonight. He had aggressively prepared for a bloody shootout, a poisoned glass of vintage wine, or a sudden, explosive ambush. He had not, under any conceivable circumstances, meticulously planned for an exhausted, highly caffeinated architectural drafter demanding immediate matrimony. A remarkably bold, highly unorthodox strategy, Julian murmured softly, his thumb casually brushing the sharp edge of the fake stone. He leaned slightly closer, his silver eyes completely pinning me to my heavy mahogany chair like a captured butterfly. Who exactly sent you? Was it the Romanos? Did they honestly believe a pathetic, chaotic distraction would successfully lower my guard before the actual strike? I literally just drafted building permits, I stammered wildly, my heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ribs. I swear to God, I am at the completely wrong table. Please, just let go of my hand. Keep the terrible ring. I need to go home. Before he could interrogate my desperate, stuttering plea any further, the heavy glass doors of the restaurant violently shattered inward. The destruction of my chaotic arrival had actually, incredibly, saved his life. The rival hit squad, heavily relying on the precise, calculated timing of Julian's scheduled meeting, had been momentarily thrown off balance when a completely unknown variable, me, sat down directly in their primary line of fire. Because Julian was leaning heavily forward over the table, aggressively inspecting my ridiculous prop ring, the high-velocity sniper round that was precisely aimed for the dead center of his chest violently shattered the expensive crystal goblet instead, showering the pristine tablecloth in sharp glass and icy water. Absolute, deafening chaos instantly erupted. The four massive enforcers at the adjacent tables moved with terrifying, highly synchronized speed, violently flipping the heavy, marble-topped tables over to create immediate tactical barricades. They drew heavy, matte black weapons from their tailored jackets, returning aggressively suppressing fire toward the shattered front entrance. Julian didn't even flinch at the deafening roar of the gunfire. His grip on my hand aggressively tightened, violently pulling me entirely out of my chair and dragging me ruthlessly down to the floor, completely shielding my body behind the thick, overturned mahogany table. The air was incredibly thick with choking plaster dust, the sharp scent of burnt cordite, and the terrifying sound of shattering mirrors. You are either the absolute worst assassin in history, or the luckiest civilian on the planet, Julian growled directly into my ear, his voice remaining terrifyingly calm amidst the violent storm of flying bullets. Either way, you are absolutely coming with me right now. He aggressively hauled me to my feet, and we ran blindly toward the dark kitchens. The sprawling, stainless steel commercial kitchen of Il Vento was a terrifying blur of panicked chefs, violently abandoned saucepans, and the deafening, continuous echo of heavy gunfire aggressively trailing us from the main dining room. Julian moved with the brutal, highly efficient grace of an apex predator perfectly comfortable in his natural, violent environment. His hand remained securely locked around my wrist like a vice of pure iron, practically carrying my terrified, stumbling weight as we forcefully navigated the narrow, slippery aisles between the massive stoves and walk-in freezers. He violently kicked open the heavy, reinforced steel security door leading to the dark back alleyway, the loud metallic crash briefly echoing over the sirens beginning to wail in the distant city streets. The frigid night air hit my face like a physical blow, instantly clearing the stifling plaster dust from my burning lungs. A massive, heavily armored black SUV was already idling aggressively in the shadows, its heavy tires entirely dominating the narrow, cobblestone alley. The rear door was instantly thrown open by a bruised, highly agitated driver holding a compact tactical weapon. Julian practically threw me into the cavernous, leather-scented back seat before smoothly sliding in beside me, forcefully slamming the heavy armored door shut just as three rival gunmen violently burst out of the kitchen exit. The heavy SUV tires aggressively screamed against the wet pavement, violently launching the massive vehicle forward and throwing me hard against the plush leather interior. Thick, high-velocity bullets pinged violently against the reinforced ballistic glass behind my head, sounding exactly like angry hornets trying desperately to break through the impenetrable shield. I aggressively curled myself into a tight, trembling ball against the far door, my chest heaving with deep, ragged sobs of pure, unadulterated panic. My cheap trench coat was violently torn. My hands were covered in minor scratches from the shattered dining room glass, and my completely ordinary, boring life had been permanently incinerated in the span of roughly 5 terrifying minutes. Julian sat perfectly still in the center of the seat, calmly straightening the cuffs of his expensive, midnight blue suit as if we had simply encountered a minor traffic delay. He didn't look back at the receding alleyway or the fading gunfire. He slowly turned his cold, silver eyes toward me, meticulously analyzing my terrified, shaking form in the dim, amber glow of the passing streetlights. "Breathe," he commanded softly, the absolute, chilling authority in his deep voice successfully slicing straight through my rising panic attack. "The ballistic glass is rated for armor-piercing rounds. You are completely safe inside this vehicle." "Safe?" I practically shrieked, my voice cracking violently. "You just dragged me into a literal Mafia shootout. I was just trying to avoid eating appetizers with an accountant. I want to get out of this car right now." "That is highly inadvisable," Julian replied flatly, casually resting his heavy arm across the back of the leather seat. "The Romano syndicate saw you sitting intimately at my table. They saw you slide a ring box to me. In their highly paranoid minds, you are now a deeply significant asset. If I let you out, you will be violently dead before morning." We didn't drive to a highly secure police precinct or a safe hospital. We drove to a towering, heavily fortified penthouse located in the very center of the city's financial district. The massive, blacked-out SUV aggressively descended into a deeply subterranean private garage, where heavily armed men immediately flanked the vehicle before Julian even allowed me to step out. I was quickly ushered into an entirely private, high-speed elevator that shot upwards, bypassing all public floors until the heavy doors finally hissed open into a sprawling, breathtaking fortress of modern glass, cold steel, and dark, polished marble. The opulence was violently suffocating. I stood trembling in the center of a massive living area that offered a sweeping, panoramic view of the glittering city skyline below. Julian completely ignored the lavish surroundings, immediately walking toward a sprawling, dark mahogany wet bar to pour 2 fingers of amber liquid into a heavy crystal tumbler. He finally turned to face me, the sharp overhead lighting aggressively highlighting the cruel, aristocratic lines of his exhausted face. He formally introduced himself as Julian, the Viper Rossi. He was the sole, undisputed head of the Rossi syndicate, controlling the eastern seaboard's lucrative underground ports, complex logistics networks, and heavy political leverage. The hit tonight was a highly calculated move by the Romanos to completely destabilize my leadership, Julian explained coldly, taking a slow sip of the expensive liquor. They believed I was highly vulnerable. But you sitting at my table, aggressively declaring marriage, it created a deeply confusing narrative. They are currently scrambling, trying desperately to understand who you are and what powerful faction you secretly represent. I let out a harsh, slightly hysterical laugh, aggressively running my trembling hands through my messy, dust-covered hair. I represent a highly depressed architectural firm that actively underpays its employees. I don't know anything about syndicates, Romanos, or hit squads. You have to let me explain this to the police. The police cannot protect you from the Romanos, Julian countered sharply, stepping closer, his imposing height actively dominating the physical space between us. The only thing that can successfully keep you breathing right now is maintaining the exact illusion you accidentally created. You proposed to a Mafia lord. You are now going to officially become my fiercely loyal, highly dangerous fiancé until I can violently eliminate the threat. Mid-story call to action, the global signal before we reveal how Elara survives the deadly Viper's nest she accidentally walked into. We want to hear from you. We are building a global community here at Blood and Roses Chronicles, and we want to know exactly where in the world you are witnessing this justice unfold. Drop your city or country in the comments below. We love seeing how far these stories of integrity reach. While you're down there, make sure to like this video and hit that subscribe button to join the fold. And if you know someone who needs to see that even in the shadows, someone is always watching, share this story with them. Your support is the fuel that keeps these chronicles alive. Now, back to the shadows. The absolute absurdity of Julian's demand hung heavily in the cold, expansive air of the fortified penthouse. I aggressively wrapped my torn trench coat tighter around my trembling shoulders, staring wildly at the man who casually held my fragile life entirely in his scarred hands. He wasn't simply asking for a favor, he was forcefully dictating the strict terms of my immediate survival. If I walked out of those heavily reinforced doors, I was nothing but a highly vulnerable, easily eliminated target for the Romano hit squad. If I stayed, I was permanently tying myself to the most dangerous, ruthless predator in the entire city. You want me to fake an engagement to a literal crime boss? I summarized slowly, my voice entirely stripped of its previous hysteria, leaving only a cold, hollow dread. I am an architectural drafter. I get violently anxious when the barista gets my complex coffee order wrong. How am I supposed to successfully convince hardened murderers that I am the fearless queen of the underworld? Julian set his heavy crystal tumbler down on the polished marble counter with a sharp, decisive click. He closed the physical distance between us, his silver eyes completely stripping away my pathetic defenses. You do not need to successfully fire a weapon, Elara. You do not need to completely understand the complex logistics of my empire. You only need to successfully project absolute, unwavering confidence. They must fundamentally believe that you are so incredibly powerful, so entirely untouchable, that sitting at my highly targeted table during an active assassination attempt was a calculated flex of your own authority, not a chaotic mistake. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and slowly produced the cheap, highly scuffed black velvet box I had aggressively slid across the restaurant table. He flipped it open, the ridiculously large, fake cubic zirconia catching the ambient light of the penthouse. You were incredibly bold when you thought I was a harmless, boring accountant, Julian murmured softly, stepping entirely into my personal space. I need you to actively channel that exact same reckless, chaotic energy. You walked right into a heavily armed room and aggressively demanded matrimony. If you can successfully replicate that sheer, breathtaking audacity in front of my dangerous rivals, we will both survive this week. He didn't wait for my verbal confirmation. He reached out, gently but firmly grasped my trembling left hand, and slowly slid the cheap, fake diamond ring onto my ring finger. The metal was startlingly cold against my skin. It felt incredibly heavy, completely laden with the dark, violent gravity of his bloody world. I looked down at the gaudy prop, then back up into the terrifying, icy depths of his silver eyes. I didn't have a functional choice, and we both instinctively knew it. I slowly squared my shoulders, actively burying my rising panic deep beneath a fragile facade of survival. I had accidentally proposed to a Mafia lord, and now I had to successfully play the dangerous part. The ultimate, highly dangerous test of our fabricated arrangement arrived 3 agonizing days later at the syndicate's annual charity gala. It was a notoriously opulent, highly exclusive event utilized strictly as neutral ground, where rival bosses aggressively paraded their wealth and quietly negotiated bloody treaties over imported champagne. Julian's highly skilled staff had spent the previous 72 hours violently transforming me from an exhausted, heavily caffeinated drafter into a breathtaking, incredibly formidable weapon. I was poured into a custom, deeply cut emerald silk gown that actively cost more than my entire apartment building. My hair was immaculately styled, and the cheap prop ring had been entirely replaced by a flawless, blindingly expensive 5-carat diamond that felt incredibly heavy on my finger. When the heavy, gilded doors of the grand ballroom finally opened, and I stepped out firmly on Julian's arm, the ambient noise of the massive room noticeably dropped. Hundreds of cold, calculating eyes immediately tracked our slow, deliberate progress down the sweeping marble staircase. The atmosphere was incredibly thick with unspoken tension, expensive perfume, and deeply hidden weapons. I squeezed Julian's muscular biceps slightly, a desperate, silent plea for stability, and he immediately covered my trembling hand with his own, offering a surprisingly warm, heavily grounding pressure. "Keep your chin aggressively elevated, Elara," Julian whispered softly into my ear, his voice perfectly mimicking a lover's sweet nothing while delivering a tactical command. "Remember, you're entirely untouchable. You are the architect of my new empire." We were immediately intercepted near the towering Champagne Tower by Don Romano, the aging, deeply paranoid boss who had actively ordered the violent hit at the restaurant. Romano smiled, a highly predatory, incredibly thin stretching of his lips that never quite reached his dead, shark-like eyes. He aggressively assessed me from head to toe, attempting to violently peel back my glamorous facade to locate the terrified civilian hiding underneath. "Julian, my boy," Romano rasped loudly, his voice drawing the aggressive attention of the surrounding lieutenants. We were incredibly shocked to hear about the unfortunate incident at Il Vento, and even more shocked to completely discover you were hiding such a magnificent secret. "Tell me, my dear, what exactly is your highly impressive pedigree? Which powerful family do you proudly represent?" My heart hammered a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ribs, but Julian's previous training aggressively kicked in. I didn't violently shrink back. I didn't stutter. I slowly took a deliberate sip of my expensive champagne, aggressively holding Romano's dead gaze with my own carefully manufactured boredom. "I don't represent a family, Don Romano. I actively build them," I replied smoothly, my voice remarkably steady and dripping with icy condescension. "I am a structural architect. I exclusively specialize in completely tearing down outdated, structurally compromised foundations and violently replacing them with something significantly stronger." Julian actively appreciates a woman who intimately knows how to successfully execute a total demolition. The entire circle of highly dangerous men went dead silent. Romano's predatory smile violently twitched, the veiled threat entirely registering in his paranoid mind. Beside me, Julian's chest rumbled with a low, highly genuine chuckle of absolute approval. My bold, incredibly reckless architectural metaphor at the Grand Gala had successfully rattled Don Romano, but it also aggressively painted a massive, highly visible target squarely on my back. The dangerous syndicate sharks now fully believed I was a highly strategic, incredibly ruthless asset specifically imported by Julian to systematically dismantle their territories. I had successfully survived the initial bluff, but the violent reality of the underworld always demands a physical toll. The devastating trap was meticulously sprung 2 nights later. Julian and I were quietly exiting a highly secure private art exhibition, walking slowly toward the armored SUV idling in the dimly lit alleyway. The heavy, oppressive silence of the night was instantly shattered by the violent screech of tires. 2 unmarked, heavily tinted black vans aggressively boxed in our vehicle, violently cutting off our only escape route. Before Julian's elite security detail could even fully draw their heavy tactical weapons, a dozen masked men heavily armed with automatic rifles poured aggressively into the narrow alleyway. It wasn't a precision assassination attempt this time. It was a brutal, overwhelming ambush aggressively designed to capture me. Julian instantly shoved me violently behind a massive, concrete structural pillar, drawing his own heavy sidearm and immediately returning aggressive, suppressing fire. The deafening, continuous roar of gunfire heavily echoed off the brick walls, completely drowning out my terrified screams. I aggressively curled myself into a tight, trembling ball against the cold concrete, wildly covering my ears as high-velocity bullets violently chipped away the heavy stone directly above my head. Julian was fighting with the terrifying, savage ferocity of a cornered predator, but the brutal mathematics were entirely against him. They were heavily outgunned and actively losing tactical ground. A masked enforcer managed to flank our secured position, raising his heavy weapon to fire directly at Julian's exposed, highly vulnerable back. In that terrifying, singular moment, the paralyzed, highly terrified drafter inside me completely died. I didn't actively think. I simply reacted purely on violent, adrenaline-fueled instinct. I grabbed a heavy, discarded iron crowbar that was lying abandoned in the dark debris near the concrete pillar. With a wild, desperate scream that aggressively tore at my vocal cords, I violently swung the heavy iron bar with every ounce of strength I possessed. The solid iron connected aggressively with the back of the flanking gunman's knees with a sickening, audible crack. The man violently collapsed, his heavy weapon clattering harmlessly to the wet pavement. Julian instantly spun around, his silver eyes completely widening in absolute shock as he saw me aggressively standing over the neutralized threat, heavily panting and wildly gripping the bloody iron bar. The momentary distraction was exactly what his elite backup team needed. Sirens violently wailed in the immediate distance, and Julian's heavily armed reinforcements finally flooded the dark alleyway, completely overwhelming the remaining ambushers. When the thick smoke finally cleared, Julian slowly holstered his heavy weapon and deliberately walked toward me. He didn't say a single word. He simply reached out and gently took the heavy iron bar from my violently trembling hands, his expression completely unreadable. The violent, chaotic aftermath of the alleyway ambush fundamentally shifted the entire dynamic of our fabricated relationship. The heavy, terrifying realization that I had actively stepped into the direct line of fire to fiercely protect the city's most dangerous predator completely erased the rigid, professional boundaries we had meticulously established. We returned to the highly fortified penthouse in absolute, heavy silence. I was completely covered in dark, gritty concrete dust, my expensive designer clothes were violently torn, and my hands wouldn't stop violently trembling from the massive adrenaline crash. Julian completely ignored his waiting lieutenants and the urgent, encrypted tactical reports violently flooding his secure communication channels. He quietly led me directly into the massive, marble master bathroom, gently instructing me to sit on the edge of the heavy porcelain tub. With surprising, incredibly tender care that violently contrasted with the brutal violence he had just successfully orchestrated, he took a warm, damp cloth and slowly, meticulously cleaned the dark dirt and minor abrasions from my violently shaking hands. "You were explicitly instructed to firmly stay behind the concrete pillar," Julian murmured softly, his silver eyes completely focused intensely on the delicate task of cleaning my scraped knuckles. His deep voice carried a rough, heavily strained edge that I hadn't heard before. "He was actively going to shoot you directly in the back, Julian," I replied quietly, my voice cracking heavily in the quiet, echoing room. "I couldn't just sit there and actively watch you get violently executed. I guess I took the fake fiancé role slightly too seriously." Julian slowly stopped his gentle movements. He completely set the damp cloth aside and slowly looked up, his piercing silver gaze locking aggressively with mine. The cold, highly calculated mask of the untouchable viper was entirely gone, completely replaced by an intense, raw vulnerability that actively stole my breath. "There was absolutely nothing fake about what you just violently did in that alleyway, Elara," he stated firmly, his heavy, scarred hands gently moving to firmly cup the sides of my face. "You fiercely protected me when you had every functional right to blindly run for your own survival. You didn't just aggressively play the dangerous part, you completely embraced the violent fire." He slowly reached into his tailored pocket and withdrew the cheap, scuffed black velvet box from the pawn shop, the original, chaotic prop that had violently started this entire, terrifying journey. He didn't open it. He simply placed it gently into my palm and slowly closed my fingers securely around it. "You sat at the entirely wrong table, Elara. But you are the absolutely correct woman," Julian whispered softly, his face hovering mere inches from mine, the heavy scent of gunpowder and expensive cologne wrapping securely around me. "The syndicate is completely secure. the immediate threats are violently neutralized. You are technically free to safely walk away and entirely reclaim your old, quiet life. But I am formally asking you to stay. Not as a strategic, fabricated shield, but as my genuine, unquestioned equal. He was actively returning my chaotic proposal. This time, it was entirely, terrifyingly real. Life actively operates on the chaotic, entirely unpredictable margins of our meticulously constructed plans. Elara was completely exhausted, heavily overworked, and simply looking for a harmless, chaotic laugh to violently break the agonizing monotony of a forced blind date. She aggressively planned for a deeply uncomfortable conversation with a boring accountant over expensive, heavily garnished pasta. Instead, she violently collided with the apex predator of the criminal underworld, permanently incinerating her quiet, predictable life in the span of a single, highly reckless moment. She completely abandoned the safe, familiar path the exact moment she aggressively slid that velvet box across the pristine, heavily starched tablecloth. The true, undeniable power in this gritty, cinematic narrative doesn't actually lie in the heavy tactical weaponry, the hidden offshore billions, or the terrifying, blood-soaked title of the massive Rossi syndicate. It lies entirely in the incredible, unyielding resilience of human adaptability in the face of absolute terror. When Elara was violently thrust into a terrifying, lethal environment where a single, tiny misstep meant absolute, immediate death, she didn't just passively surrender to the crushing, overwhelming darkness. She aggressively weaponized her own chaotic audacity to survive. She meticulously used her sharp, quick wit, her street-level observation skills, and her deeply ingrained courage to completely outmaneuver hardened, professional killers who severely underestimated the sheer tactical advantage of an ordinary, exhausted woman backed entirely into a dangerous corner. Justice and survival in the unforgiving criminal underworld aren't merely about desperately maintaining your fragile innocence. It is strictly about aggressively maintaining an uncompromising, powerful balance of fear and respect. Julian Rossi, a terrifying man violently conditioned from birth to view every single human interaction as a highly calculated, heavily armed transaction, was completely disarmed by genuine, unfiltered chaos. Elara teaches us a profound lesson today. True, unshakable strength isn't always aggressively measured in bullet calibers, vast bank accounts, or heavily armed security details. Sometimes, it is successfully measured in the quiet, calculated ability to aggressively stand your ground, to fiercely wield an iron bar in a dark alleyway to protect the one you love. When the entire world is violently demanding that you run away in absolute terror. She didn't just barely survive the deadly viper's nest she accidentally stumbled into. She successfully conquered it by fiercely refusing to be the helpless, screaming victim everyone actively expected her to be. She proved that an ordinary spark can entirely consume an empire. If that final glimpse of Elara standing tall and unyielding beside the throne sent a chill down your spine, then click that like button right now. Subscribe to Blood and Roses Chronicles to join our community for more cinematic journeys into the shadows. Drop a comment below and let's talk about that hard-earned justice. Remember, the world might see someone silent or broken when they look at you today, but never forget, you hold a signal that can change everything. See you on the next one.